Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. We're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Marca, the director. Now, I already promised you a presentation of a very special record-setting airplane for next month, but this month we are fortunate to have a pilot who knows all about setting records, having met many of them himself. And he has done this in some of the most celebrated airplanes in aviation history. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce Tom Morgenfeld.
Thank you, everybody. This is an overwhelming turnout here. You think I owe you money or something, I guess. I thoroughly enjoy talking about airplanes. I feel a little stilted behind a podium, so I would love if you keep your questions till the end, and I'll answer them all, but I'll stay here all day long and talk about airplanes if you want. I took a look at some of the presentations you've had in the past, and they all seem to be focused on a single airplane. I thought you might want a little break from all the technical stuff. This is a compilation of my lifelong love affair with Lockheed airplanes, and it's mainly a collection of sea stories and also a little look at how cockpits have evolved over the time. If anybody wants to talk about any of the airplanes in particular, I'm more than happy to do it afterwards. I have always had a deep feeling for Lockheed airplanes. There's a few others, to be sure. For the most part, those are four that have certainly been some of my favorites. My beloved Crusader on the left, the airplane I flew in the Navy most, little MiG-23 time, YF-17 time, and my commuter to work airplane. I bought into this aviation thing a big time many years ago. I commuted to work in that little Mooney for many years. I want to tell you about my love affair with Lockheed airplanes. Interesting that Cindy showed the model of the P-38 because that was the first Lockheed airplane that really, really caught my attention. As a boy, you could only dream of flying something like that. First fighter to go over 400 miles an hour. It looked different from most. It absolutely caught my attention. That's my first Lockheed airplane. I bet you we got a bunch of aviation experts there. Does anybody know what that is? F-94. There you go. That was my first Lockheed airplane. I know I'm old, but I'm not quite that old. That is an F-94. For those of you old enough, it's a Strombecker wooden model kit made by my dad and myself when I was, as best I can guess, maybe 6, 7 years old. I still have it. There's a lot more Wilbur in here than there is Tom, as you can well see. But at the time, Lockheed airplanes were really super. My dad was really super, and he instilled in me a love of airplanes. So for all you young mums and dads out there, beware of what you give your kids these days. You could turn out like this. It's just not pretty. No, you have a lot of influence, more than you think. Finally, I got to fly a Lockheed airplane. Anybody want to venture a guess what that guy is? That's a T-1A, a Navy trainer. We used that for proficiency flying when I was going through graduate school in Monterey. It actually was a lovely little airplane. We used to take off out of Monterey for our 4 hours a month of flying. We'd usually go on out and in, and we'd go over to Lemoore and jump on the attack guys because they thought the A4 was a pretty good turning airplane until they came up against a little airplane with 7.3 Gs and a nice straight wing, and we'd go flounce around with them for a while and then come back, get some gas, and go home. It's a lovely little airplane. That's a picture of the cockpit. Tons of gauges and dials. It reminds me of some of the British airplanes I flew where they claim that the engineers just filled a bucket with gauges, had the mechanic go out and throw it up against a blank instrument panel, and wherever they hit and made a dent, they'd drill a hole and put the instrument. It's not horribly well laid out, but it served its purpose. Finally, I got a chance to fly for Lockheed. I'm getting closer here. What you see there is the Alpha Jet. I hired into Lockheed, into the F-117 program, but there was about a year slip, and so there was some time available. Dassault and Dornier approached Lockheed with the idea that we would build and market this airplane to the Navy for the for their basic trainer. I had nothing to do at the time, so I had to take one for the company, and I had to go to France for 2 or 3 weeks and learn how to fly this airplane in the south of France. It was terrible duty. But I had just gotten off of active duty with the Navy. I had done a lot of interesting things there, and thought I was a halfway decent fighter pilot. Well, this is our hero over here on the right in the picture, the lower right, our hero walking out for his first flight in the Alpha Jet. And just as a point of interest, with me is Jean-Marie Saget. Anybody here know of Jean-Marie other than Bob Johnson? Okay. Jean-Marie is perhaps one of the most experienced test pilots and aerobatic pilots in the world. He's probably flown more first flights than people in the U.S. have flown different types of airplanes. He is just going over 20,000 hours, mainly an hour to maybe 2 hours at a pop. He's just gave up flying Vampires, and he now flies the Cap 10. How old is Jean-Marie? 85? Something like that? Still flying hardcore aerobatics. He's a unique gentleman. Anyway, walked out to that airplane. There it is, sitting there with no paint on it. It looked to me like a big dumpling. And all I could think of was, oh, man, how low have I sunk just to put food on the table for my family? I was not horribly impressed, a little trainer like that, and it just didn't look too good. But cockpits are getting better. Gauges are getting better integrated. They're laid out a little bit better. This is an interesting picture because you can see how close you are to the ground in this little thing. We took it on a tour, a sales tour. We flew the airplane, depending which day it was, but generally 7 times a day. 3 customer, if you will, flights in the morning, 3 in the afternoon, and at noontime, one of the company pilots would put on a quick air demonstration with the airplane. It was a very hectic month, but it was a lot of fun. Anybody here have any connection with marketing? No, okay. You can always tell marketers, right? When they're lying, their lips are moving. This was an interesting story. We'd come in a brief, and the marketers would always have a little pre-brief. They say, okay, you're going to fly with Eddie Rickenbacker today. You know, he was a World War. They give you a background on the fella. Well, I was to fly a rather influential congressman, and I was told, oh, he's an old Air Force pilot, no problem. You can put him in the front seat. Things will be good. So we briefed very carefully and got in the airplane and started to go through the checklist, and all of a sudden, the warning signs, hair on the back of my neck started to go up. And I said, this guy, there's something wrong here. Anyway, make a long story short, he was not a pilot. He was in the front seat. I was in the back. Fortunately, the Alpha Jet's fairly well equipped in the back. I could do most everything. And we got through the flight without any major damage or to either the airplane or our sales our sales potential, I guess. It was a wonderful little airplane. Really came to like it over the years. That's a picture of the airplane when we finally had it all painted up. That was an ugly Duckling that really turned out to be a Swan. I tell everybody that's the best airplane Lockheed never made. It's one of those few airplanes that whatever you're man enough to try, it's man enough to do. And I've flown very few airplanes like that in my life. As a matter of fact, it was the right airplane. The Brits are now buying used Alpha Jets to replace their Hawks, the one that won the competition. Onward and upward. That's a picture of the very first YF-117. Interesting airplane. Through that, I think we basically changed the course of tactical aviation forever. I'm not here to tell you that stealth is the be-all, end-all, but it is a big advantage. And if you don't believe that, ask the guys that are out there fighting F-22s and F-35s right now. It's a big advantage. It was a thrill to be part of this. We really felt that we were a big part in ending the Cold War. And it was a highly motivated small team of people, which I've been fortunate to work with many times. Hey, look, television's in the cockpit. The F-117 cockpit is a combination of kind of 50s, 60s technology and 70s, 80s technology. At the Skunk Works, we don't invent anything we don't have to. We steal what we need to, we modify what we have to, and we invent only what we absolutely have to get the airplanes to fly. So what you're seeing in there are actually F-18 displays on either side. There was other F-18 parts in the airplane, including engines. It was just easier to steal one out of every 20 off the production line and get it into the F-117. In fact, I hate to admit this, when I got hired into Lockheed, I thought it was because of my sterling aviation ability or my stunning good looks. It turned out it was none of those at all. It was because I'd worked on the F-18 while I was still on active duty with the Navy and had a lot of experience developing electronic displays. However, it worked out just fine. Interesting airplane that way. This is a picture of the first airplane. I was the most junior test pilot on the program. You see on the canopy rail Skip Anderson, unsung hero, the first Air Force pilot to fly the airplane, and Hal Farley, our chief test pilot at the time, who flew the first flight on the F-117. My name, if you see it up on the right there, up in lights, is a result of a small incident. As usual, we let the chief pilot do most of the engine runs, so he gets a general feeling for how it sounds, smells, feels, so you might know what's going wrong. But after a while, when the chief pilot has to fly first go in the morning and the engine needs to be run in the middle of the night, it's the junior pilot that goes out to do that. And I had started out the run, everything looked pretty good, and then all of a sudden everybody's eyes got big, everybody but the crew chief fled the hangar immediately, and it turned out I was on fire. It was nothing big. There was a wing sock with these little booties they put over your shoes so you don't mar the finish of the airplane when you walk across it, and one of them had been left back in the tailpipe area, and that torched off. And I don't even smoke anymore. Okay, going ahead a couple months, now I am smoking here. This was the third flight of the third airplane, which is the first fleet-configured F-117. I took off, and immediately the radio kind of burst into all sorts of sounds, so I thought, well, I better leave the gear down and figure out what it is. The nose wheel had fallen off the airplane, just a little maintenance error. And so now I'm flying around, and I said, what are we going to do? And the control room said, well, stand by. We're thinking. I said, okay, well, I'm going to, all it was, and let me take a step back. I think, and I know Bob will back me up, that the dangerous flights and flight tests aren't the hazardous trials, because there's so much oversight of those, you'll probably never get airborne, let alone have a problem. It's the quickies. This was a quick flight to get airborne, to look at some display improvements, okay? So anyways, I can look at the displays with the gear down just as good as the gear up, so I went around and flew around. And they said, well, we've pooled the best minds we got, and we think that this thing could easily somersault when you land. We want you to go out to the controlled ejection area and jump out. I didn't like that at all. And I'd spent enough time on the carrier watching F-8s get nose gears to realize that it probably was going to be okay. So I said, tell you what we're going to do. You're going to put a little foam on that runway, and I'm going to land this bad boy, and we'll see how it works out, which is what you see there, all the smoke and hate and discontent coming off the nose gear. That airplane, by the way, we had it flying within a couple days. We changed the inner barrel of the nose strut, and it flew on. That was on a Tuesday, I think. When we got back home on Friday, I got off the airplane and from our test location, and our flight test secretary said, Ben Rich wants to see you in his office. And I thought, oh man, I've only been with the company like a year and a half, 2 years at that point. I thought, if this is the military, they might give you a medal. I don't know, maybe this will be a big cash award for saving their airplane, right? And then the secretary says, he sounded angry. I thought, boy, I don't get that at all. Now I'm rather conflicted. So I went over to the headquarters building, and I walked into Ben's outer office, and his secretary was on the phone, and I said, Ben wants to see me, and she gave me one of these, oh, yeah, oh, man. Now I'm really conflicted. So I walked into the office, and there's Ben Rich and Kelly Johnson. And anybody that has been around Kelly knows he could be fierce. And neither one of them are looking pleased at all. And now my guts are churning. I have no idea what's going on. And Ben said, how you doing, Tom? I said, oh, fine, sir. He said, I heard you had a little incident earlier in the week. I said, yes, sir, but it turned out okay. And there's old Kelly over on the side going, oh. I'm thinking, what in the world? And I said, is there a problem? And Kelly says, you bet there is. And he hands me a grievance sheet that the union had signed for a non-union guy grinding on a nose strut without the proper union training and clearance in it. And it was a total wind-up. It was something I learned about leadership, and it's something we had in the Skunk Works for many years. It's a pretty rare thing for the bosses to come in and tease the junior test pilot. What impressed me even more than that, though, after they had their joke at my expense, and I came back off the ceiling, they said, okay, sit down and tell us how it's going. So I had 10, 15 minutes of just my impression of the airplane, and they were interested in that, and they ate it up. It's the way you build airplanes, and stuck to my mind completely. Teaching the Nighthawk to hunt. This was my primary area of responsibility, was weapon separation, the avionics, all the infrared system, all that stuff. That was my area of responsibility. And it turned out, with all the crazy fly-by-wire, the crazy shape, all the stealth stuff, that this was the long pole in the tent, as they say, for getting to initial operational capability. When we finally got there, it was heartwarming. In fact, when Desert Storm started up, I'd sit and watch the tapes and I think, holy smoke, it really does work after all. It was hard. It was hard work, but it was a lot of fun. At the end of that, I got a personal letter from Mr. Dick Heppy, who was the president of the company at the time, thanking me personally for my efforts. And I just bring that up to show you the human element in leadership that goes on, that really, I have a collection of letters from people, and you'll hear more. Finally, out of the closet and into the limelight, we were able to come into the white world, and after almost 10 years of leaving Monday morning and coming home Friday all cranky, I was able to tell my wife what we were doing. For 10 years, 9, more like it. If anything went wrong, she had an 800 number to call, and that was it. So she's the real star of this show. I get the glory, she got the hard work. We did have a secure telephone that we could call home once in a while, and I knew when I said, hey, how you doing? If the first thing out of her mouth was, you need to talk to your son, I thought, this is not going to be good. No, they're good boys. They're good boys. But it was really pleasant to finally be out in the real world and be able to talk about the airplane a little bit. Finally, out of the limelight and into retirement, the F-117 has stood down now. Thousands of hours left on the airframes. Hopefully they're looking after them and we'll be able to use them if we really need to. It's a splendid airplane for what it was designed for. It's one of the advantages we have in the Skunk Works is building point designs. You don't have to build a all things to all people kind of airplane. So anyway, I just put that in there because that was a good shot anyway. Really pretty. Finally, I got to fly a real Lockheed fighter. These are the 5 guys that flew the YF-22 in the Denvale part. I know there are Northrop people here. If I see a gun come out, I'm going to dodge real quickly. On the far left is Dave Ferguson, my best friend and my boss for many years. We did many things in the service together. We had a lot of adventures together, and I certainly miss him. He passed away here a couple of years ago. John Beasley, just to the right of me there, is the fellow that was in the F-22 later on and flew the first flight of the F-35. Great little guy. Mark Shackelford, since an Air Force general. And the last fellow on the far right is Willie Nagel, Air Force F-15 pilot, who, after his career in the Air Force, went to work for my brother at Airborne Express, which I thought was kind of an interesting, small world aviation is. That's the YF-22 cockpit. Holy smokes, we got a lazy boy in the cockpit, which I thought was pretty cool. One of the things that we were supposed to be looking at in the Advanced Tactical Fighter program was ways to protect the pilot under high G loads. We were trying to be able to sustain 9 Gs, which really hurts for extended periods of time. One of the ways we thought of doing this is to have what we called an articulating ejection seat, that if you felt you needed to use really high Gs, there was going to be a button on the stick, and that what would happen is the seat pan would slide forward, it would raise you up, and you'd be more horizontal than vertical, and it lowers the blood column between your brain and your heart, and you can sustain higher Gs. The only problem with that whole system was we had to go down to Brooks Medical Institute and ride the centrifuge for a week, just doing 9G endurance runs. No fun at all. The things you have to do every once in a while to fly are incredible. Anyway, we're getting a lot more displays. That was, as far as I know, one of the first uses of touchscreen displays, at least in a fighter. The engineers called it finger on glass, called it FOG. I called it FOG, but I called it fist on glass because it was a little more than frustrating at times. It worked out just fine. This is Dave flying the very first flight of the airplane, and I threw that in there because it's just such an incredibly pretty picture. This was before the days of Photoshop. That's a genuine rainbow, and we actually flew almost a month behind Northrop, and we were scared and trying to play catch up. I was the lead chase pilot on that, and I was in the airplane in an F-15 at Edwards, and Dave was all fired up at Palmdale. We build the airplanes in Palmdale, and then the first flight is a ferry flight over to Edwards. And weather was threatening. Weather in the whole area was not good. We were behind, a lot of pressure to get flying. So it came down to my call. They said, go ahead and launch and see if we can do this. And so, okay, blast it off. I'll fly any old time. And I looked around. It looked pretty good. I think, the weather between Palmdale and Edwards looked good. So I said, launch him. Went down. Fergie fired up. Takeoff. Big squall comes right on through Edwards. And one thing you don't do with prototype airplanes is fly them in the rain. And all I could think of was, I've just killed my best friend. This is not the best day of my life. Anyway, it worked out just fine. We got that picture and went on to do the rest of the flight test program with the YF. In this test flying business, some days you bite the bear. And I had one of those days. Was the end of December. In fact, it was the last day we flew. I got a chance to do max Mach, max G, and max altitude on the YF-22 all at once. For those of you that don't know, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but the competition for the Advanced Tactical Fighter was an engine competition as well as an airframe competition. So each company built two airplanes. One had a Pratt & Whitney engine, one had the General Electric engine. My responsibility was the YF-22 with a Pratt & Whitney engine, which I always had to bring up to Mr. Ferguson. That was the one that won the competition and not his airplane. But anyway, I finally got a chance to fly the GE-powered one, which in the YF-22 had a gazillion pounds more thrust. It was a totally different airplane. I was told, okay, we're going to go max Mach. We're going to do Mach 2 today. I said, oh, that's cool. We can do that. How are we going to do that? I was used to speed runs in most airplanes. You do this big climb, dive, Rakowski profile. And in fact, most airplanes, you wind up spending most of the mission just getting to whatever the max Mach is. So we went out way east of the Colorado River and shot on down. And I remember saying, how are we going to get there? I expected the engineers to have some big profile. I said, well, I want you to climb to 33,000 feet, accelerate to 1.3, and climb at 1.3. And I thought, really? And it did. It was really impressive. Turned around, headed west, and coming down the supersonic corridor, got to 1.8 Mach, 1.9, doing my test pilot stuff, bashing the controls around and doublets and all that stuff we do. And I said, okay, you're cleared to Mach 2. And pushed the throttles up, got to Mach 2, and by this time, Hawaii is coming at me pretty darn fast. Actually, we were in the Edwards area yet, but we were getting to the end of the road pretty quickly. So I grabbed what I thought was a gob of throttle back. I said, boy, I think that's got to look like I was stabilized, did my test pilot stuff. And by that time, we'd gone out to 2.03, which was pretty impressive. And that airplane had a lot left at that point. Anyway, went back, did a wind-up turn, got to some elevated G. It wasn't anything spectacular, 7 point something or other, and came back and landed. One of the best days of my life. Just got a chance to fly a marvelous airplane, do things that are really cool. So some days you can bite the bear. And then there are other days that the bear bites you. And this was later on in the follow-on. That's the worst 6 seconds of my life. Just a short video of me crashing the YF-22 at Edwards in the follow-on testing. Not the happiest moment of my life, for sure. That ejection seat that I said reclined. Does anybody here have a car that has a seat back that doesn't recline? I don't think you do anymore. Oh, yeah. Well, I do too, but they're all 1950s cars. I mean, it was really nice, and I had the seat back relaxed a little bit, and I think that's what really saved my back. I hit pretty hard. In fact, what you see, the flames are, it tore the left engine loose from the mounts and started the fire. Be that as it may, my morale was right down there with the bottom of the ocean, and after a couple days, I got another handwritten letter from Mr. Sherm Mullen, who was the president of the company at the time, and saying, "Hey, bad day. We're still proud of you. We're happy to keep you around." And believe me, that went a long way. In fact, Hank Chodo's name was mentioned here. Remember Hank? A lot of people here probably know Hank. He was one of the first to call me because he'd had a PIO incident in the F5, I think, maybe, or the YF-17, one of the two. But his was at altitude, and things got gathered up. He told me, he says, "Watch out, they'll try to blame this one on you." And I thought, well, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. But anyway, instead of that, I got a nice letter of reassurance from the president of the company. I thought that was wonderful. Again, it's a little bit of leadership. Okay, another competition. And this is a picture of the first takeoff of the X-35 out of Palmdale. It was probably one of the biggest thrills I've ever had. I've flown first flights on other airplanes, but never really the first flight. I mean, I flew the first Pratt & Whitney powered F-22 without any other F-22 time. Kind of neat, but this was the first one. A lot of pressure, not for yourself, but for the thousands of people that work so hard to put that thing together. You just don't want to fumble the golden football. Where did all the dials go? This is the nicest prototype cockpit I've ever flown. There are two little gauges in there. You can see them way over on the right side. We couldn't figure out anything better for the hydraulics, so there's a couple little gauges. It's a lovely, lovely cockpit, nice bright displays, and the folks that did that did a wonderful job for us. It shows you how cockpits have evolved over the years. That's a far cry from the old Sea Star, the T1. This is our hero getting ready for the first flight. It's all strapped in, ready to go. Whenever we fly a first flight at Lockheed, we always have a helicopter standing by with medical people just in case something happens. They can get to you quickly. And everything was ready. We had two F-16s all ready to go. The X-35 was ready to go. Weather was beautiful, not like Fergie had a face. But the helo was down, and he was down for just servicing. But the kind of hydraulic fluid he needed wasn't on the base, so they had to go Palmdale or someplace to go get it. Edwards. So on that day, I violated one of the main rules of flight test, which is never go to the airplane and pass the John on the way without going into the John. I'm in agony. By the time we get started, I knew this wasn't going to be good. That last cup of coffee. So if you get anything out of this, never miss that opportunity. There's a picture of the first flight. Back in the 50s, they would go supersonic on the first flight. My beloved Crusader went supersonic on its first flight. This day and age, you're lucky if they can get you to let you pick up the gear and whatever. We had decided and sold the fact that we're going to pick up the gear, we're going to do some aileron rolls, very easy stuff, just to get a better feel for the airplane. Unfortunately, when I went to pick up the gear, one of the micro switches, or proximity switch, in one of the gear doors wasn't quite adjusted right, so the gear came up, but the gear doors didn't close. So we put the gear down. Happily enough, they all came down. We landed at Edwards and called ourselves the victors. That was good. Interestingly enough, on the first flight of our second prototype, different switch, but same kind of thing. And therefore, we demonstrated complete commonality to the customer between our airplanes. that was absolutely the thrill of a lifetime. Raining at Edwards, that's a time-honored tradition. That's me underneath all that ice water. Thanks to Lester behind me there. And from there, at that point, I went from the best day of my life to one of the worst. This is me in the Soggy Debrief in my soaking wet flight suit. I'd been given by the company PR folks, could be those same marketers, a script of what I was to say about the airplane, which I stuck in my pocket and never used. That didn't make me happy. You could hang meat in that room. It was about 40 degrees in there. It was cold. I was soaking wet, trying to look suave and debonair, and I wasn't doing too good a job of it. Interesting in this picture, on the far right, you see the young lady, rather blurry? That's my daughter-in-law. Naval Academy graduate, helicopter pilot, best daughter-in-law a guy could ever have. She's great. But what she's saying to herself is, I married into this family. On the far left, covering his eyes, is perhaps the best test pilot in this country that nobody's ever heard of, Mr. Joe Sweeney. He was in charge of the Navy airplane. He's a flight controls genius, along with being a wonderful, wonderful pilot. And it's due to his work that the Navy airplane is, the Navy version of the X-35, F-35, is so easy to land on the ship. But Joe is sitting in the back. I can see him. I work for this idiot. This is just not good. So anyway, not the happiest time of my life. We took the Navy version of the airplane to Patuxent River, and they were absolutely blown away by it. It was really good for me to get back after so many years of working with the Air Force, which I dearly love, by the way. But to get back to the Navy a little bit, fly the ball, it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And that airplane, boy, I've got over 500 carrier landings in the Crusader, and there have been a couple nights I would have cut off any redundant part of my body to be flying an airplane like this. It's just too easy around the back of the ship. Really good. That is the last flight of the X-35 on the 6th of August, 2001. It was probably one of the more melancholy days of my life. I hadn't told anybody yet, but that was the end of my revenue paying days or earning days. We set a record for at least manned X airplanes at the time. I would still be up if I could still find any more tankers. I think I tanked like 5 or 6 times. Just I wasn't gonna come back until I had to. Anyway, that's one of my favorite views of the airplane. It really is a pretty airplane when you see it in the air. That was my last flight. Was the last flight of the X-35. At that point, YF-22 was in the museum. These were headed to the Smithsonian. I figured if the niftiest airplanes you've ever flown in your whole life are in a museum, it's probably time for you to be in the museum too. And that ended my test flying career. It was certainly the end for me, but beginning for another really great Lockheed Martin airplane. I know there's a lot of Northrop people here pouring their heart and souls into that airplane. And as usual, you hear a lot of bad press, but I think people are going to be impressed in the end. It's one hell of an airplane. And that's what I had prepared. I'm more than happy to take the time to answer questions. The question is, why did the YF-22 go down? It's really a complex explanation. I'll be happy to. I fell into a hole in the software, which we didn't know was there. It's just one of those things that happens. We can talk about it later. It's going to take a little math and a little whatever, but one of those things. Stuff happens, right? That's a good question. The question is, could I expand a little bit on teamwork? I've been really fortunate. I got spoiled when I was still on active duty with the Navy. Number one, you go through test pilot school, you're in a, I can even go farther back to that. You're in a Navy single-seat fighter squadron. It's a small group of people, and you learn to rely on your wingmen and your leaders. I went to test pilot school. Again, it's a small group of people. And then I was fortunate enough when I started my testing career to get involved with flying some Russian airplanes, and that was, again, with a very small group of people. You didn't have to go through a lot of bureaucracy. You know what belly button you got to poke. We all worked for each other. We all worked headed in the same direction. I left active duty and went into the Skunk Works, and it was very much the same. Small groups of people with good lines of communication and leadership, not just managing to a budget or a schedule. But I don't know if people do it. I certainly didn't see it much in my closing days at Lockheed. But a handwritten note from the president of the company can make you want to walk out and spit in a bear's eye. I mean, it costs you nothing, and that's leadership. I can remember a case, I don't know what happened, but it was Friday. We'd gotten back from our test location on the F-117, and whether it was weather, it probably was a combination of weather, airplane issues, whatever. We were beaten puppies. It had just been a terrible week. We got much accomplished. When we were getting off the airplane that ferried us back to the real world, Ben Rich was at the bottom of that ladder, shaking everybody's hands. He had a unique talent that he could remember people's names. Even some of the mechanics calling them by their first name and saying, hey, bad week, next week's going to be better, no problem, guys. That's leadership. Most of us were ready to get right back on the airplane and go back to work. I mean, it's important. And it's easier with a small team. That's why I stayed with the Skunk Works. I would be totally lost on a big program. I don't do politics well at all. Leadership's important. Personal touch. The question is, would I comment on the YF-22, YF-23 competition? This is Tommy speaking, okay? This is my simplistic view of the whole thing. I'm very good friends with both Paul Metz and Jim Sandberg. We've talked a lot. If you were to show somebody that didn't know what company built what airplane, and you put a YF-22 out here and a YF-23, you say, okay, Lockheed built one of these, and Northrop and McDonnell Douglas built the other. Which one would you think? I bet you most people would say that Lockheed built the YF-23 because it looks so much, there's a lot of SR-71 in it, and they would probably bet that a McDonnell Douglas influence went into the F-22, and it did in a kind of a backdoor manner. My impression is that Northrop built the Air Force exactly what they asked for. Stealthy, super cruiser, no doubt about it. I know they didn't get to the speeds we did. There were some issues with the dual actuators, something like that. No problem, can't be fixed. But we built the airplane that I think the Air Force wanted secretly. If the word is pandered, I don't think that's quite the word, but we built an airplane. The spec hadn't really stressed too much the maneuverability of the airplane. We felt that was still important, and we went to great lengths to give them an airplane that was more F-15-ish and has tremendous maneuver capability. And I don't think it was a bad choice, but that's the difference. I think we gave the Air Force the airplane they secretly wanted when Northrop built the airplane that was exactly what the Air Force asked for. The question is, would I comment on some of the Russian airplanes I've flown? I'm a little shaky ground here security-wise, so I'm just going to go with the ones I know have been released. I got a chance while I was in VX4 at Point Mugu to do the tactical exploitation, if you will, of a MiG-23 airplane. I found Russian airplanes to be very interesting. I later got into a situation where we stood up the very first aggressor squadron, the 4477th. How the Air Force gets all these big numbers for squadrons. There's only one of them, but it's the 4477th. Test and evaluation flight at the time, we had MiG-21s, MiG-17s. I've flown both of those as well, and the MiG-23. Interesting airplanes. Not the kind of airplanes we would build here. We tend to maybe polish things a little too much. Sometimes we take maybe too good a care of the pilot. They build airplanes that are more straightforward, but their capabilities are staggering. The one that I really like to bring up is a MiG-21. I've flown F-4s, F-14s. A lot of those airplanes, if you decide you want to go to a max speed run, that's your mission for the day. It's going to take you a whole tank of gas. The MiG-21 could get to Mach 2 and use that tactically. And it didn't even have a powered rudder. The rudder is just push rods. Nothing. And the ailerons weren't even full powered. They were just boosted ailerons, pioneered by the Lockheed P-38, by the way. And it had an all-powered tail. Very simple airplane. We had taken a brief back to the Defense Intelligence Board on these airplanes, and the Army guy, this is the generals that are head of all the intelligence people, and the Army guy says, well, let me get this right. He says, you're telling me that the Russians build their airplanes to go to war and we don't. And I think, well, wait a second, that's not what we said. I kind of took umbrage at that because I think the F-14 and the F-15, those are wonderful, wonderful airplanes. He said, by that, I mean, they build an airplane, they can afford to lose one or two of them and not break the bank. And that's true. They can cookie cutter MiG-21s out about as fast as Cessna can cookie cutter out 182s almost. So very, very capable airplanes. Not the nicest to fly, not the nicest handling qualities, but deadly potent in certain arenas. And quite reliable, actually, too. The question is, how do our airplanes stand up to those? I don't know anything about the latest versions of these things, but everything I flew wouldn't stand a chance against what we're building now. No, there's Su-27s and follow-ons are pretty potent. What I do know is I don't believe anything can touch an F-22 right now, for a lot of good reasons. The question is, did we ever land on a carrier with the X-35? No. That takes a lot of buildup. We have here a carrier expert. Bob Johnson was the head of carrier suit at PAX for years, and I think he can tell you how long it takes to get people up to speed. What we chose to do is take the airplane and what we call field carrier landing practice, and they basically set up what looks like a carrier deck on the field, put a Fresnel lens up there, we get LSOs out. It's what every naval aviator does getting ready to go out to the ship for initial quals or recurring quals, whatever. And we started flying approaches. And right to touchdown, once we figured we checked the gear loads and everything. At that point, we went on and we had a big matrix of test points. We started out with some easy ones, like what happens if you're overshoot at the start, or if you're a little bit low or a little bit high at the start. The Navy has some fairly rigorous definitions: start, in the middle, in close, at the ramp, and touchdown. And we had plans to test various off-nominal conditions. At the end, and we only flew this for a couple months over there too, we were doing some of the nasty ones, like high and fast in close, low and slow in close, low and lined up left, and well, that's the A-B airplane. That's not the Navy airplane, but the X-35. I knew we were doing well when the LSO came into the debrief. I hadn't flown. I just sat in on every debrief, and the LSO came in to give the debrief of the pass, and he said, "That's the darndest airplane I've ever seen." He said, "I will take him aboard from off nominal condition from a point closer in than I will an F-18. The F-18 was our benchmark. We thought if we could build an airplane that was at least as good as the F-18 around the ship, because it is the gold standard right now. If we could even come close to that, we stood a good chance of selling this multiple role airplane, if you will. Well, when he said that, I knew we had a dynamite airplane. It was through the flight controls, as I like to call them, automagic flight controls. It was extremely easy, very forgiving to fly, and it just seemed to want to be on speed, on glide slope. It's a really nice airplane. Bob? Bob's question is, are we using the magic carpet, which is a technique that the F-18 is using? Joe Sweeney invented that for the X-35, and they stole it and put it into the F-18. Frankly, that's what happened, yeah. Yeah, that's, we coupled up direct lift from the ailerons with throttle input, and it was just, we did it out of desperation. We were afraid, the X-35 and the F-35 have one huge motor. I mean, it's got in burner like 40,000 pounds of thrust. But when you're coming aboard the ship, 40,000 pounds of thrust does you no good at all. You have to be able to get from 20,000 to 20,300 quickly, predictably, smoothly. That's far more important. And with that big rotational inertia, we thought we were going to have problems with it. So we were doing everything we could. We put an approach power compensator in there, auto throttle, cruise control, whatever, as well as Joe's invention of direct lift, of integrated direct lift. Navy had direct lift control years ago. F-14 had it, S-3 has it, but it was a separate control. I never could figure out, I can't do that. With the F-14, I never could work that other switch, so. But when you integrate it into the automatic flight controls, it just happens. I mean, it is sinfully easy to fly. The question is, do we use this, or I use the STOVL capability of the airplane. The biggest disappointment in my aviation career, after years of probably spent, maybe 15 years from the very start of this program in a simulator, developing the whole program. I've got a fair amount of time in the Harrier, but because I was not NATOPS qualified, Naval Aviation Standard, they wouldn't let me fly the B model in the STOVL configuration. So politics at the time, not the happiest time of my life. We did a fair bit of preparation, but we spent thousands of hours in the sim just developing the thing. I will say that what I could see of it in the simulator was really solid. It's turned out to be even better, I think, in the F-35. So, what's the role or the mission of the F-35? That is a multiple-pronged answer. There are basically three versions of the airplane. There's an and I'm talking about things I know less about, so I will talk about X-35, okay? It flowed out pretty well into the F-35, but there's three basic variants. There's the F-35A or X-35A, that's the Air Force version, easy. Us Lockheed pilots aren't too bright, so we keep things simple. F-35A, Air Force. The Marines, the STOVL version is the B, you think of Marines on the beach, got it. And the X-35C carrier is the Navy version. They each differ slightly because what we try to do is build an airplane that's got a lot of commonality to save money, but without trying to make them so generic that somebody pays a price. I never knew till we got working on the B model how much a pound meant to a STOVL airplane. So there's no reason why that airplane should suffer with the heavy landing gear that a Navy airplane has to have, for instance, okay? So there are three versions. The Air Forces, probably the laws of physics say they're going to have one of the best ones. They always do because they don't have to live in the shipboard environment. Excuse me. B has the shaft-driven lift fan concept. I can come back and talk about X-35 all day long. And the Navy airplane, to slow it down, to make the approach speed more appropriate for the carrier, it's just got a bigger wing. We elected not to put boundary layer control or anything fancy on it. So, what is it? It's sort of an all-purpose airplane, but in the Air Force version, it's the easiest to understand. They use the F-22 for air-to-air with a backup roll of air-to-ground. F-35 is just the opposite. That's a primary air-to-ground airplane. I wish they called it an A-35 because it would have made it clearer to a lot of people's mind what it really is. It was mainly designed as someone to make war a little nearer and dearer to people's hearts as an attack airplane. It's got great legs because it's a single-engine airplane. Mainly air-to-ground with air-to-air capability. Using very advanced techniques, the Northrop people are putting tons of work into the weapons system of the airplane. That's, strangely enough, the things that cost the most are the engines and the avionics. You can change the airframe. You can put different landing gear on it. You can a little different. It doesn't cost you too much in the long run. That's why they look a little different. But it's the avionics that are going to be common, and that's where they save money. But think of it as an attack airplane with a really solid air-to-air backup. That's what it's for. The question is, would it be fair to say the F-22 is a better dogfighter? More than fair, absolutely accurate. That was what it was designed for. Remember I said we built the the F-22 is what the Air Force really wanted. The F-15 Mafia was pretty powerful in the Air Force at the time, and that was the not a pound for air-to-ground guys, right? Everything was strictly air-to-air, and that's what the F-22 was designed to. They've just been putting air-to-ground weapons in it more lately, just to give it an expanded role. How important is maneuverability to modern fighters? I don't know of a fighter that maneuverability wasn't important. As weapons improve, though, it does make that less and less of a threat. We're only good to about 9 Gs, and even then it hurts. After, tell you an interesting story, which is a total aside, and I'll get back to that in a minute. We were riding the centrifuge for a whole week doing these 9G endurance runs. Oh man, was that painful. And what would happen is, because of the G-forces, we had our arms, anything that hung down here, arms, the back of your thighs, were all bloodshot, hurting like big hickeys almost. It was just awful. And it was physically painful. And at the end of the week, we were complaining to one of the centrifuge operators about that. And he said, what they would do is pay enlisted people. They'd get $20, $30 a ride on this thing. We got nothing, right? And they said, you should do what the enlisted guys do. They wrap ace bandages around their arms and their legs. Now you tell us, right? After we're sitting here bleeding to death from the back of your thigh. Anyway, maneuverability is important, but the human body is probably good to about 9 Gs, and to think we can go much more than that, it really isn't going to happen. You can get a missile that can, 9 Gs is nothing. So if you get decent weaponry, it takes away the need of the airplane to be maneuverable to a certain extent. But if you got an air-to-air airplane, it needs to be able to turn and point its nose, too. Can I talk about the F-8 Crusader? I can talk about the F-8 for the rest of my life. Now, the cowboy always likes the horse that gets you home no matter what, right? It was just a wonderful airplane. Again, one of those, it was a little more demanding around the rear end of the ship than the F-35 or X-35, I would say. As we jokingly tell everybody, we were just stupid enough to think that night ramp strikes were part of the job. A great airplane. It was the last Navy airplane that I know of that really could outperform its Air Force counterpart, which was the F-100. We used to love to dogfight with F-100s because they were meat on the table to us. 1955 design, supersonic on its first flight. That was the day and age when everything was kind of focused towards performance. So it had some shortcomings. Usually the last 3/4 of a mile was the one. But just a wonderful airplane. It has a tremendous following. We are having, Norma, 38th? I think 38th last annual Crusader reunion, and we still get 300-400 people come to it for an airplane that hasn't flown in years and years and years. It's one of those airplanes that you just love. Have I flown any European fighters? The only European fighters I've flown several. We had Hunters and Lightning, English Electric Lightning on the test pilot school course, and I've flown the Draken and the Viggen with the Swedish Air Force, and those are the only ones I've flown other than the Russian airplanes. You know? The question is, in the case of my missing nose wheel, what was the cause? We had stolen the nose wheel design from an F-111, and which I think is a dual nose gear on the F-111. I don't remember. I never flew the airplane, but the F-117 has a single wheel like that, and the way the axle, the nut locks on there was rather arcane, and our guys just missed it. So I started the takeoff roll, and thank goodness it stayed on. But while we were rolling, because of the way the thing was threaded, it was unthreading that nut as I went down the runway. And the minute I rotated, poof, off it went. I could say it bounded down the right. It went a long way down the runway. The question is, after I lost the nose wheel, did I sing "You Picked a Fine Time to Leave Me Loose Wheel"? That did come up immediately after that. Like the little flames around my name. You can't do anything that doesn't get a little attention, and usually it's all in good sport. So the question was, when we were going through the decision whether to eject from the F-117 without the nose wheel or stay with it, I used my judgment based on watching, I probably didn't say it well enough at the time, but as Bob Johnson knows, the F-8 was pretty famous for breaking nose gears on carrier landings for a long time. And I've seen any number of guys land with a broken nose gear, and it wasn't pretty, but nobody ever got hurt. And usually the airplane was almost instantly, well, depending on how hard it hit. My limited experience in the YF 117 and what I'd seen before led me to believe we could probably get away with it. We were, what is kind of hard to remember, we were locked in mortal combat with the Soviet Union at that time. The Cold War was still raging, and if we'd have lost that airplane, that was the first fleet configured airplane. That was our main avionics airplane. I was just going to do everything I could to get it back in as few pieces as possible. So it's just, after a while, you just learn to go with your experience. I mean, they made their recommendations, and in the end, I think we did okay. The question is, on the picture of the F-117 skittering down the runway with the nose gear there was a drag chute. The early airplane, because remember I said at the Skunk Works, we don't build anything that, we steal parts if we can. It had Gulfstream brakes, and they were fairly marginal. And company was fairly used to drag chutes because the SR-71 has one. In fact, there's a lot of SR-71 parts in that drag chute. And so we went with the drag chute. That was de rigueur. After a while, we replaced the brakes with these huge things, so you don't need the chute. Strangely enough, not strangely enough, but one of the things that made me make the decision to stay with the airplane is when the chute would come out, and believe me, it would throw you into the straps. I could go back to it. It's a big, big chute. But it also gave the airplane a little bit of a nose-up pitching moment. So I thought, well, that's only going to help keep the weight off that nose strut. So that was just one of the other little things that went into my mind. Very effective drag chute, but obviously they don't use them now at all, but they don't have to. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.